The year was 1876, and the wind came dry through the cottonwoods, carrying dust that clung to eyelashes and settled in the bones of the quiet land. Nothing moved on Ezekiel Rowe's ranch but shadows, long, stretched out like ghosts across the porch slats, and the cries of two newborns wailing inside the house that hadn't heard laughter in weeks. A hawk circled overhead. The chimney gave no smoke. Even the cattle stood still, as if mourning. Somewhere under the hard-baked soil behind the barn lay a woman barely 25, her death still fresh in the wood grain of Ezekiel's hands. He stood by the corral fence, staring at nothing, his arms like carved granite folded across his chest. His hat brim sagged from too much weather, his shirt clung damp with effort he didn't name. He didn't know if it was grief or guilt or just the ache of being left behind. The babies had been born screaming, both alive, both pink and breathing, and yet somehow it had still felt like a loss. The town said nothing to his face, but he heard them. Heard the mutters at the feed store, at the church steps. That Ezekiel Rowe had married a girl too delicate for this life. That he hadn't known what to do with a woman's heart, much less her labor pains. That now he had two mouths to feed and no wife to warm the house. A knock came soft on the frame of his open cabin door, just past midday when the sun was high and mercy low. He turned, slow as thunder rolling in, and saw her. Julia May stood there in a sun-worn dress, the hem faded and patched with thread that didn't match. Her hands were folded, her face unreadable but kind in that quiet way certain women carried, like they had once been something precious and had learned, over time, to be useful instead. She had salt and pepper hair pulled back in a low bun, not gray exactly, just tired. But her eyes were warm, and they held their gaze even when Ezekiel narrowed his own. "You're the one they sent," he said, voice like split cedar. He wasn't trying to sound cruel. But he hadn't slept in days, and the twins never cried at the same time. One would start just as the other dozed off, like grief traded shifts. "I am," Julia answered, not stepping inside. "They said you needed someone." "I said I needed help with the babies, not a housekeeper." "I ain't here to decorate your windows, sir." Her voice held neither apology nor pride. Just calm, like water in a jar. "I raised my sister's 5 children after she died of the fever. I can keep them alive." Ezekiel looked her over. She wasn't what he expected. He didn't know what he'd hoped for, truth be told. Maybe someone younger. Maybe someone who wouldn't remind him that life didn't wait for healing. "You're here only to look after my newborn babies," he said, jaw tight. She nodded once. "That's all I'm good for, I reckon." He left the door open as he turned away, and she took that as permission. Inside, the cabin smelled of milk gone sour and soot from a fire burned too hot. The cradle sat uneven by the hearth, a quilt bunched like a forgotten apology. One twin fussed, fists like blossoms curled in protest. The other had gone quiet, lips seeking air. Julia dropped her bag gently and moved toward them, her hands sure. Ezekiel watched from the doorframe, his shadow long on the floorboards. She lifted the baby with practiced ease, adjusted the blanket, and hummed. Not a song with words, but the kind of tune that came from memory more than melody. "That one's Jem," he said gruffly. "The other's Ruth." "They don't know their names yet," she replied softly, "but they'll know the voice that says M." That evening, she cooked with what little remained in his pantry. Cornmeal, beans, dried onion, and ate standing at the window, not asking for a seat. Ezekiel sat near the crib, boots heavy on the floor, feeding Ruth 1 awkward ounce at a time. Julia didn't comment when he used the wrong end of the bottle nipple. Later, when the sky bruised to purple and stars blinked shyly into view, she folded a blanket across the cradle and tucked them both in. Her hands lingered just a moment longer on Ruth's tiny shoulder. "You sleep upstairs," Ezekiel said, not quite meeting her eye. "I'll sleep here," Julia answered. "They'll wake soon, and it ain't right for them to wait." He nodded once and climbed the stairs without another word. The twins woke twice before midnight. The first time, Julia soothed them with warm palms and slow breath. The second time, one of them coughed, a sharp, wet rasp that rattled the stillness. Jem's face turned blotchy, his lips trembling without sound. Ezekiel stumbled down half asleep, shirt undone, wild-eyed. "What's happening? Is he?" Julia didn't answer. She turned the baby gently, thumped his back in soft, rhythmic pulses, then tilted his chin, coaxing air into him with practiced calm. A moment passed. Then a small, gurgled cry broke through. "He's fine," she whispered, cradling him against her chest. Sometimes they forget how to breathe. The world's too big at first. Ezekiel sank to his knees, one hand on the cradle to steady himself. The fire had gone to embers. His face looked younger in the low light, like a boy lost in the dark. Julia didn't reach for him, didn't speak comfort. She simply wrapped Jem tighter and rocked, letting silence do its work. The next morning, Ezekiel found her outside at dawn, hanging cloth diapers on the line. The horizon glowed amber, and her figure, slim but strong, moved like part of the earth itself. She didn't turn when he approached. "I can pay you in grain," he said, "and whatever money comes after harvest. I didn't ask for wages. I don't want charity." Julia looked at him then, face unreadable again. "Then let's call it an even trade. I feed them. You let me sleep where it's warm." A strange peace settled between them that day, though neither named it. She swept the floors. He fixed a broken chair. She found a tiny boot in the ashes and scrubbed it clean. He made extra porridge and pretended it was just for the twins. The next afternoon, he caught her staring out the window at the hills. "You have people?" he asked, more out of obligation than curiosity. "Had a brother once. He sold his land and said I made the place look old. Told me not to come back." Ezekiel didn't speak, but something in his jaw tightened. "I ain't anyone's first choice," she added, folding a dishcloth. "And I'm fine with that." He looked at her then, not the dress, not the graying hair, not the hands scrubbed raw with soap, but her. The way her mouth quirked when she talked about loss. The way she cradled Ruth as if the girl were made of glass and gold. That night, she sang again. Just one note, barely louder than a breeze. Ezekiel stood in the hallway, listening like a man overhearing the sound of water after a long drought. He almost stepped inside. Almost. But instead, he stood still, caught between the comfort of distance and the ache of drawing near. And as the fire cracked low and the cradle swayed gently, Jem stirred, opened one eye, and reached a tiny hand toward the shadow at the door. Julia May moved through the house with the ease of someone who asked nothing and noticed everything. She never lingered, never sat unless invited, and never spoke unless silence had already said its piece. She washed the dishes slow and steady, careful not to clink them loud enough to wake the babies. Ezekiel Rowe, true to his nature, said little. But his eyes tracked her now, not with suspicion, not with warmth, but with a kind of distant reverence, as if trying to memorize the shape of something he wasn't ready to believe was staying. She folded the same diaper 3 times before he finally spoke. "They cry less now," he said, not looking up from the cradle. "Babies always do when someone listens," she replied. He gave a single nod, then crouched by the fire and added a log. Flames caught, licked up like they'd missed being noticed. The days passed like that, quietly, one gesture at a time. Julia didn't push. Ezekiel didn't open. But something softened in the air between them, like a porch step worn smooth by the habit of return. He began repairing the loose shutter without being asked. She hemmed his shirts with tiny stitches so neat they were nearly invisible. Once, he came in late from the barn with blood on his knuckles. A mule had kicked, he said. She didn't fuss. Just set down a bowl of water and began wiping the wound with warm cloth. His skin flinched, but he didn't pull away. Her hands were cool, and she didn't meet his eyes, not until she tied the bandage and whispered, "You bruise like someone who doesn't care if he gets hurt." Ezekiel didn't answer. But that night, he left her a fresh apple on the windowsill. She never asked where he got it. The babies grew louder in their needs, hungrier, fussier, demanding more than just survival now. Ruth began to recognize faces. Jem wouldn't sleep unless held. It was Julia who carried them across the floor when the wind howled, Julia who whispered songs into their soft hair, Julia who knew which cry meant colic and which meant loneliness. One morning, after a frost snapped the leaves to the ground, Julia hung laundry near the barn. Her fingers were red, but she hummed low, as if singing to the sky. Ezekiel came out, carrying fence wire over his shoulder, and paused. "You always hum?" he asked. "Only when the quiet starts to feel heavy. You ever think it's better that way? Quiet. I used to." She clipped a sheet to the line. "But now I think quiet's only good if someone's close enough to hear what you're not saying." He didn't answer, just watched the sheet flap between them like a curtain that wouldn't quite open. Inside, Julia cleaned the cradle with a damp rag, humming a hymn her mother once sang. It wasn't for anyone's benefit. Just something old, something that made the air feel less like absence. Ezekiel passed behind her, his boots scuffing softly. "Why don't you take the day off?" he muttered. Julia glanced up. "To where?" He shrugged. "Town, maybe. Walk the square. There's a church social today. Might be pie." She folded the rag. "Not sure I'd be welcome." "You kept 2 babies alive for 3 weeks with nothing but flour and grit," he said. "You'd be welcome." She held his gaze then, unsure what surprised her more, his words or the fact that he had noticed. Later that day, she took a walk into town. Wore a faded shawl. Tied her hair back neatly. The townsfolk didn't look at her cruelly, just quickly. The women nodded politely but didn't invite her into circles. The men barely looked at all. One of them, a merchant's son, maybe 20, muttered "spinster," just loud enough for her to hear. She smiled anyway. Not at them. At the sky. When she returned, twilight had settled into the bones of the land. The porch light flickered weak and golden. Inside, Ezekiel rocked Jem awkwardly, one massive hand patting the child's back with all the rhythm of a wagon over stones. "They were loud," he said, sheepish. "They missed me." Julia took the baby and adjusted the blanket. "So did you, maybe." He didn't respond. But he didn't deny it. Dinner was quiet. She ladled stew into tin bowls, and they ate without talking. But she caught him watching her hands, how they moved, how they didn't shake, how they never paused for permission. The next day, she found a stool by the stove. It was handmade, rough but sturdy, with her initials carved faintly on the underside. She didn't ask who made it. Just sat down on it and peeled potatoes like it had always been there. But the peace didn't last long. The following Sunday, the preacher came by with his wife, a narrow-faced woman with sharp eyes and tighter smiles. They stood on the porch, hands folded, mouths taut with concern. "We understand the arrangement," the preacher said slowly, "but it's not proper for an unmarried woman to be living here." Ezekiel stood tall behind the screen door, arms crossed. "She's not here for me." "Appearances matter," the preacher replied. "There's gossip." Julia stepped out quietly, apron still damp from washing. She didn't defend herself, just looked at them like they were weather, something to endure, not engage. Ezekiel's voice was low. "Proper ain't what feeds babies." The preacher frowned. "You know the church won't support this." "Didn't ask you to." That night, Julia stood outside, arms wrapped around herself, watching stars blink through winter's breath. Ezekiel stepped beside her, offering a shawl she'd thought she'd lost. "Don't mind them," he muttered. "I don't," she said. "But I mind what it makes you think of me." He was silent a long time. Then, with that same restrained cadence he always used when saying something honest, he whispered, "I don't think of you the way they do." She didn't look at him. Just nodded once, sharp and small. Later that week, while he chopped wood, a boy from town delivered a letter. Julia opened it by the stove, her face unreadable until the end. Then her lips tightened, her jaw clenched, and she folded it slow. "From your family?" Ezekiel asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "My brother," she said, voice tight. "Said I should stop using his name. Said I'm old enough to be forgotten." Ezekiel said nothing. Just placed a cup of water beside her hand and walked out into the cold. That night, while the babies slept and the house settled into its creaks and hush, Julia sat in the rocker by the fire. She held Ruth against her chest and hummed the same wordless tune, one finger tracing small circles on the baby's back. Ezekiel stood in the doorway again, like he had before, half shrouded in shadow. "They know you," he said. "Better than they ever knew her." Julia looked up, startled. She was soft, he added, his voice cracking slightly. But she didn't know how to stay. Julia said nothing, but her fingers stilled. And Ezekiel, fumbling for something more but unable to name it, walked toward the fire and knelt down to stir the embers back to life. The flames rose. The silence between them grew warmer. And from the cradle, Jem stirred and reached again, not for the fire, not for the warmth, but for the voice that sang without needing to be heard. The first yellow leaves fell with barely a sound, catching on fence posts and cradling the corners of the porch like secrets too old to speak aloud. The air had changed, no longer summer's heavy heat, but a thinner breath, touched with the crisp promise of winter. Julia felt it in her bones. A shifting, a pulling away, not from the weather, but from something more fragile, more invisible, something she hadn't let herself name. Inside the cabin, the light had a different quality now. Softer, more lived in. The cradle rocked smoother on its worn legs. The scent of stew and cedar smoke lingered after dark. The babies had grown. Jem had a cry that sounded like protest, and Ruth now reached for Julia's braid when sleepy, curling her tiny fingers in the salt strands like they were silk. Ezekiel no longer flinched when their hands brushed. He even laughed once, low and hoarse, when Jem soiled his shirt and Julia quipped, "That's love, plain and unfiltered." And yet, there were new footprints by the gate. She noticed them first one morning, right after sunrise. Small, deliberate boots. Not Ezekiel's. Too fine for a ranch hand. Later that day, she found a ribbon, blue silk, caught on a fence nail. He didn't mention it. But the silence around him thickened. He looked out the window more. Smoked longer on the porch. Julia didn't ask. She just wiped her hands dry and kept feeding the twins. The visitor came 2 days later. Her name was Emmeline Hart, and she looked like spring painted in flesh and bone. 23, flaxen curls tucked under a straw bonnet, lips pink with youth and purpose. She arrived in a hired buggy, stepped down in kid gloves, and carried a basket of peach preserves. "Brought these for the little ones," she said sweetly. "And for you, Mr. Rowe. My condolences, of course." Ezekiel stood dumb, jaw tight. Julia was at the well, watching. Emmeline hadn't even glanced toward her. "I heard the babies survived," Emmeline continued, voice bright. "Thought I might call and help. I've done a little nursing." Julia walked up slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. Ezekiel shifted. "This is Julia May." Emmeline turned, finally. Her eyes flicked once to Julia's hair, to the lines around her eyes. "Oh," she said. "You're the help." Julia smiled the way a tree withstands wind. "They needed feeding. That's what I've done." Emmeline offered a thin-lipped smile. "How noble." That evening, Julia mended a quilt alone at the table. Ezekiel sat by the fire, sharpening a blade he hadn't used in months. Emmeline had left, all sunshine and syrup, promising to return with gingerbread and gossip. "She's kind," Ezekiel muttered. "Pretty too," Julia said, not looking up. He hesitated. "You think I need someone like that?" "I think you don't know what you need." She stood then, and the way her chair scraped back sounded final. The next day, the mail came late. The town boy brought it on horseback, handed Julia a crumpled letter sealed in cheap wax. She read it outside, hands shaking only once. It was from her brother. Short, sharp. "You've shamed our name long enough. Don't use it. Don't come back. We've buried you in word, and now we mean to in deed." She folded it slowly and burned it in the stove. That night, she packed a bag. It wasn't dramatic. No slamming, no sobbing. Just quiet choices, 2 dresses, a shawl, Ruth's teething rag, and a sewing kit wrapped in muslin. She set the bag near the door. Ezekiel noticed. "What's this?" "I think I've stayed past the welcome." His brow furrowed. "You've been needed. I'm not the need anymore." He stepped forward. "This ain't about that girl." "No," Julia said. "It's about me." She looked at him then, not with hurt, not even with anger, but with something softer and more heartbreaking. Resignation. The ache of having once hoped. I'm not the kind of woman a man starts over with, Ezekiel. He swallowed hard. I never said. You didn't have to. She reached for the shawl and folded it over her arm. You want a wife who still smells like spring and hasn't been told she's too old to matter. You don't know it yet. But you will. I didn't ask you to leave. And you didn't ask me to stay. He looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time, Julia saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of loss. Fear of needing. You think I'm trying to replace her, Julia whispered. But I'm not. I never wanted to. I just wanted to matter while I was here. A baby cried. Ruth. Julia crossed to the cradle and lifted her with ease, pressing the child to her shoulder. The motion felt final. I'll take her out back. She needs settling. Ezekiel nodded, jaw clenched. He didn't stop her. Outside, the stars had begun their nightly vigil. The air was sharp, and the wind picked at the hem of Julia's dress like a child begging her not to go. She rocked Ruth slowly, watching the sky, humming that old tune again. The same one from the first night. Her voice cracked in one place, but she kept singing. When Ruth drifted off, Julia returned inside, laid her gently down, and tied her bundle closed. Ezekiel sat at the table, staring at a worn spoon. I'm leaving at first light, Julia said. He didn't reply. She turned to go upstairs to sleep. But just before she reached the step, he spoke. If you go, he said, his voice low and raw, I won't stop you. She froze. A breath caught behind her ribs. I don't know how to ask you to stay, he added. I don't know how to need someone again without fearing what it'll cost. Julia turned, her eyes shimmering, not from tears, but from understanding. The same kind she'd given a baby who didn't know how to latch. The same kind she'd offered her sister once, long ago, when fever had taken everything but duty. You don't have to ask, she whispered. But you do have to want. Upstairs, the cradle creaked as one of the twins stirred. Julia looked at the stair, then back at him. Good night, Ezekiel, she said, soft as dusk. She climbed each step slow, as if savoring a house she might never see again. Ezekiel sat alone by the fire, flame light flickering against his stubbled jaw, his hands open but empty on the table. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a strip of muslin cloth, the one Julia had used to clean Ruth's gums when teething, and held it between his fingers. Outside, wind chimes rang in the dark. Upstairs, Julia packed in silence. And in the cradle, Ruth's tiny hand reached out, as if searching for a voice that had once promised she would never be alone. Morning came without her. The cabin felt larger, hollower, like the bones of something once living. The twins cried more often. Ruth whimpered instead of wailing, a thin, confused sound. Jem stared at the ceiling longer than before, as if waiting for a shape he used to know. Ezekiel moved through the space like a man trapped inside a question. He fed them, changed them, even tried rocking, but his hands were clumsy without hers guiding them in silence. The cradle creaked louder now. He boiled oats, but burned them. He washed the diapers, but left them stiff. The house was cleaner but colder, as though Julia had taken not just her shawl and bag, but the very warmth of the floorboards. Her absence wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was quiet. A subtraction so soft it echoed. On the second day, he found a curl of gray hair in the rocker's cushion. On the third, he found the tiny muslin cloth she used to clean Ruth's mouth tucked under the edge of the cradle. She had folded it like a keepsake, clean, soft, still smelling faintly of milk and lavender. The fourth day, Jem refused the bottle altogether. Ezekiel sat on the porch, elbows on his knees, staring into a morning that had nothing to say. A crow called from the fence. The wind rustled the dried corn stalks, brittle as old paper. He held the cloth in one hand, rubbed it between his fingers like a worn prayer. You're not good at this, he murmured aloud. Not like she was. The twins didn't answer. They were napping again, fitful and short. He didn't know what he expected. Julia wasn't the kind to make scenes or send letters. She had no kin to speak of. The preacher's wife mentioned she might be helping an older couple out near the orchard, but it was said with pursed lips, like it didn't matter where she went as long as she went away. Ezekiel stood, slipped the muslin cloth into his pocket, and saddled the mule. He didn't write a note. Didn't leave instructions. He just looked once at the cradle, then rode out slow beneath a sky full of questions. The orchard was 5 miles out, tucked near the edge of what used to be old Comanche land. Autumn had browned the apple trees, their branches bowed and almost bare. He tied the mule and walked the rest of the way. The house was small, 2 rooms and a crooked porch. A chicken scratched at a splintered barrel. He saw her before she saw him. She was bent over the washbasin, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back in the same no-nonsense knot. She moved slower than before, more careful, as if her body remembered something her heart hadn't caught up to. He didn't speak, just watched her hands for a moment, hands that had once wiped blood from his knuckles and sweat from a crying newborn's temple. Those same hands now hung linens like nothing had happened. When she finally turned and saw him, she didn't gasp or drop the sheet. She just blinked. "You lost." He shook his head. "Looking for you." Her face didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. "I brought something," he said, and pulled the small box from his coat. It was carved crudely from barnwood. No polish, no hinges, just nailed shut and tied with twine. Julia took it slowly, her fingers brushing his. She untied the string, opened it. Inside, the daisy crown she had made for Ruth, pressed flat between 2 pages of the old family Bible. The shawl she'd wrapped Jem in on the first frost night. And the muslin cloth, folded neatly. Julia stared down at it all. "I kept these," he said, voice dry. "Didn't mean to. But the house felt wrong without them." She looked up. "You came all this way to return old rags?" "I came because I can't settle that house without you in it." Her eyes flickered. "That's not something you should say out of pity." "It's not pity," he said, stepping closer. "It's knowing the fire burns lower. The bread turns out flat. The twins won't sleep. And that means you need a housekeeper." "No," he said. "That means I need the woman who sang in the dark so the babies wouldn't be afraid of the silence." Julia held the box to her chest. "You didn't stop me, Ezekiel. When I packed. When I walked. I didn't know how," he said low. "Didn't know if I had the right." Her voice cracked slightly. "And now." He looked at her fully. "Now I know I don't want them to grow up thinking she left because she was unneeded. Or unwanted." Julia stood still, as if the wind itself had paused to listen. She blinked fast and cleared her throat. "You're not a man who uses sweet words." "No," he agreed. "But I know the sound of an empty chair. I know the look in their eyes when they don't see you first thing in the morning. And I know what it feels like to be warm, then cold again." Silence fell between them, broken only by the flap of drying laundry. She whispered, "You're asking me to come back?" "I'm asking you to choose me," he said. "Not for what I lack, but for what I see when I look at you." "And what do you see?" He stepped forward, closed the space. "I see the woman who stayed when no one else did, who held their heads when mine was bowed. I see a home with your hands in it." Julia blinked. Her throat moved, but her words didn't rise. A faint cry echoed in the distance. Ezekiel turned. It wasn't one of the twins. It was a neighbor's child. Scraped knee, loud sob. Julia handed him the box and walked toward the sound without hesitation, her feet sure on the grass. He watched her kneel, wrap arms around a stranger's child, whisper calm with the same old melody she used at his hearth. She looked back at him once, cradling the child, and for the first time in days, smiled, just barely. He nodded, tucked the box back under his arm, and turned to go. That night, he left the box on the cabin table, unopened. The babies were fussy, overtired. He walked them in slow circles, humming her song. It didn't come out right. He tried again. Jem settled. Ruth didn't. He set her down and lit the lantern. Then walked out to the porch, into the quiet chill. The night was empty. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "I said my piece." Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something new. Not hers. His. A carved sign, small and crooked. Letters uneven but true. Home. He set it on the windowsill. And upstairs, in the still room where the cradle waited, the muslin cloth stirred as if touched by wind. It was the hour just before dawn, when the world holds its breath and frost crusts the edges of every windowpane. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, a soft red glow casting shadows that flickered like memory. Ruth stirred in her sleep. Jem sighed and curled tighter under the quilt. And Ezekiel sat at the table, still in his work clothes, boots dusted from a walk that had yielded no words, no answers, just air that tasted like maybe. He hadn't slept. The wooden box sat unopened beside the cradle. The carved sign, home, rested on the sill where he'd placed it the night before. The house was clean, but not alive. Not yet. He kept listening for her footsteps out of habit. Each creak of wood, each shift of wind across the shutters tricked him a little more than it should have. But then, just as the horizon paled from ink to pearl, he heard it. The latch turned. Slow. Careful. As if she wasn't sure whether she'd be let in. He didn't move right away. Didn't dare. Just stared at the door as it opened to reveal Julia May, her shawl pulled tight, hair wet with mist, cheeks raw from cold, and something behind her eyes that looked like fear dressed in hope. She stepped in. Didn't speak. Set her bag down. He rose without sound, heart hammering like hooves inside his chest. The fire cracked, as if in greeting. Jem stirred. I couldn't sleep, she said finally. Kept thinking about the way Ruth reaches for my braid, and the stew you burned, and the fact that no one ever carved me a sign before. He swallowed. You came back. I never left, not really, she murmured. I just waited to see if you'd make room. Not for help. Not for duty. But for me. Ezekiel took a step forward, then another, slow as thaw. I never knew how to ask, he said, voice soft. Didn't think I had the right. You still don't, she said gently. But I give it to you. She was trembling. Not from cold, but from the ache of being seen. I'm not the prettiest, she whispered. I've been called worn, bitter, too old for new starts. He reached up, brushed back a damp curl from her temple. Then they never saw the way you hum when the sky's dark. Or how steady your hands are when everyone else falls apart. Or how you made this place a home without ever asking for one back. He stepped closer, lowered his voice. I don't want someone young. I want someone who's already survived what I'm still learning. Someone who's weathered. A tear slipped from her eye. She didn't wipe it. I can't promise joy every day, he added, his voice rough. But I can promise you a place to sit. A meal at the table. And a hand that won't let go easy. Julia nodded, biting her lip, her face trembling in that way only truth can cause. The twins began to cry. She stepped past him without pause, arms already moving. One hand to Jem, the other to Ruth, her voice rising in that soft familiar melody. No words, just comfort. The cries settled. The house exhaled. Ezekiel watched her, awe in his silence. Then he moved behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist from behind. She stiffened for half a heartbeat, then melted. I built a second rocker, he whispered into her shoulder. You did. I wanted you to have a place beside mine. She turned, looked up at him, and smiled, slow, radiant, like sunrise finally cresting over winter hills. Then let me sit, she whispered, pressing her forehead to his chest. He guided her to the hearth. The new rocker creaked once, then stilled. She sank into it with Ruth in her arms. Ezekiel knelt beside her and took Jem into his. They sat like that, quiet but full, the firelight painting gold across the wood grain and skin. Two babies, two chairs, two hearts that had been broken and still chose to beat again. Julia looked down at the children. They don't know it, but they chose us first. Ezekiel chuckled, low. They always see clearer than we do. A knock came on the door. They both turned. It was the preacher. His face was drawn, lips tight. But before he could speak, Ruth cooed in Julia's arms, and Jem clutched Ezekiel's thumb with startling strength. The preacher blinked, took off his hat. I came to say I was wrong, he said, voice low. The town's been watching. Some of them whispered, but not anymore. Ezekiel rose, didn't speak. The preacher looked at Julia. I told folks love had rules. I forgot sometimes the best homes are built from things no one else wants. Julia rose, still holding Ruth. I don't need their blessing, she said gently. But I'll take their silence. The preacher nodded. You'll have it. And if you don't, let me know. He left without another word. Julia turned back to Ezekiel. Well then, she whispered. Well then, he echoed. They spent the rest of the morning tending to the babies, hanging laundry in the chill breeze, and laughing. Quiet, startled laughter, like it had been waiting a long time to come out. By afternoon, Julia was at the stove, rolling out dough. Her apron was stained again. The smell of cinnamon filled the house. Ezekiel sat on the porch, carving a small block of wood. At sunset, Jem crawled for the first time. Julia wept, silently, with a hand pressed over her mouth. Ezekiel came in, knelt beside her, and kissed her temple. That night, they ate by lamplight. Not fine food, just stew and bread, but it tasted like celebration. Like something earned. Like home. After the meal, Julia stood and reached for his hand. Come sit. He followed her to the rockers, and they sat side by side, one baby each. The fire crackled low, shadows dancing like children across the floor. Jem gurgled. Then Ruth, her voice a breath, a miracle, said, Mama. Julia gasped. Her eyes welled. Her lips parted. She looked at Ezekiel, then down at the tiny girl in her arms, who smiled like she knew. Ezekiel leaned close. That sound, he whispered. That's the sound of home choosing you. Julia nodded, tears falling freely now. Then I'll never leave again. The fire burned low. Wind touched the windows. And the home sign on the sill caught a slant of starlight. Small, imperfect, sacred. It wasn't a mansion, or a wedding, or a promise made loud. It was a flower-dusted apron hanging by the door. It was twin heartbeats asleep in a cradle. It was the way she looked at him when he wasn't watching, and the sound of his boots beside hers at the porch step. And maybe that's how new nests are built, one quiet gesture at a time, until even the wind knows where to return.